Hello and welcome back to the channel. As I record this, it's the 14th of April 2024. Last year on this day, it was a Friday the 14th of April, and my dad had just under 2 weeks to live. This is April 2023 that we're looking at here. On April the 11th, he fell down the stairs in his house, smashed his head against the sort of gas meter, the old lecky meter at the bottom of the stairs, knocked himself out, came round some amount of time later. We never quite knew how long he'd been down there for, knocked out, unconscious, because he didn't remember the fall. When he came round, he crawled back up to bed and then stayed in bed for, again, we don't really know the exact amount of time, but it was pushing up to something in the region of about 40 hours. So we had the fall on the 11th, crawled back up the stairs, and on the 13th, he rang my sister-in-law to kind of get out of a family event. Said, I'm not feeling very well, I can't make it, it's fine. And my sister-in-law could tell something was wrong, having none of it. He said, I've had a little bit of a fall, I'm fine, I just need to get some painkillers. My sister-in-law was having none of it. She scarpered round there, found my dad in an incredibly poor way, and against his will, as it were, under severe protestation, dragged him to the hospital. So on Thursday the 13th, he was in hospital. He was then on a general ward with oxygen and painkillers and general treatment up until the 14th. And then it overnight from the 14th into the 15th. So this is just over now. We're April the 14th, 2024 as I record this. So on the 15th, my brother got a call at 5 in the morning to say that they'd moved my dad to intensive care overnight. Because his condition wasn't getting any better, and they'd now detected pneumonia. On Sunday the 16th, I went over to see him. That's where I picked up that video here, the My Dad Died video, which is on the channel. I'll link it below. I got to see my dad. He was awake. When I got there, he was awake, but he was in intensive care. I visited with him on Sunday the 16th. Going into the 17th, the plan was that we'd do some stuff for him in his room. We were going to get him a digital photo frame for him to look at. And I was thinking about getting him a laptop with a 3G connection, maybe get a cheap mobile phone so we could tether it to a laptop, or get him on the Wi-Fi in there, something like that. But then overnight, from the 16th to the 17th, late at night, about 11:30, on the Sunday, we got a call from the hospital to say that he'd had a really bad turn and they were going to have to sedate him so that they could put him on a ventilator. We did a mad dash out to the hospital in the small hours of the 17th, which was Monday. We were able to talk to Dad before they sedated him so that they could ventilate him. Basically, they put you into a medical coma. That was in the small hours of Monday morning, and that there was the last time that my dad was conscious. They kept him alive all the way until the 27th, when we got the call to say that they were going to remove support. And on April the 27th, 2023, he died after they removed support. It was a year ago now. We are now pretty much at the, like I say, we're the 14th of April here. So at this time last year, I was aware that my dad was in hospital. I'd spoken to my brother on the Thursday evening, but there was no real panic. It was like, Dad's had a fall, he's in hospital, he's conscious, he's talking to us. We'll let you know when he's getting better, kind of thing. It was only when it started to go downhill and he moved into intensive care that there was even then, I've got to be like, obviously it was like, well, this is not great, but none of us had a clue. None of us had a clue of what was coming. Even when I went over on the Sunday, saw my dad in intensive care on the Sunday, I did not remotely think for 1 second that this was going how it was going to go. And this is kind of coming to the point of this video, is on this one here, this is what it looks like, by the way, in Vegas movie studio. So when I went out to the pub on the first night there, which is in the video here, when I went out in the pub in Bury, I was like, we'll see Dad tomorrow. We'll get things on we'll make things comfortable for him in the hospital, and he'll get better, and that'll be that. It's not great, but it's all going to be fine from here, and it really, really wasn't. So after all of this shit had blown over last year, or I'll say blown over, after it had all finished, I did the video about my dad's death. I did the video about the funeral. I got some machine stuff in there. I am aware that this is like a Fruit Machine and a Fruit Machine emulation channel, so I took the time. I was in the pub anyway, drinking and playing the machines. I thought I'll video them. They'll do for my documentation of this for the channel. But I kept pissing about with this video to get it into a bit more of a complete state. To start with, I just tweaked the ending a little bit. In the end, I ended up making quite a few changes. Not fundamentally. The point here is that I am going to re-upload this video as it is here. I got to the point where I was thinking about doing a complete re-edit on it, because it is kind of in the moment as I was there, because I was recording this day to day, and there are chunks of time which are just like I'm covering days in just a couple of minutes on the timeline here, with no commentary, with just some music and some graphics. And I thought maybe I should change that. But the more I got into it, the more I thought, you know what, I'm going to leave the structure of this fundamentally unchanged, because it is a very kind of raw documentary of this as it was happening, just day to day. I didn't know. At the start of this process, I didn't know where it was going to finish. I certainly had no idea that it was going to finish off with the death of my dad. So in the end, what I've decided to do is just stick with the odd little change to the actual kind of timeline. Mostly what I've done is added some more text and some graphics. I put a little bit of an explainer around a couple of things as well. There's a little change here at the front where I've brought up the audio of my dad in hospital. That's the very last footage that we have of my dad when he was alive. That's me there. Little bit of an explainer about that. So this one will be going back up as we're kind of a year down the line now. This video will be going back up. I'm going to render it back out as it is here, I think, which is fundamentally the same video as before. So if you did watch it first time around, I'm not saying that it warrants another 2 hours 40 minutes of your time. I was slightly surprised by how many people actually watched the whole thing first time around. There was quite a few people posted publicly at Casino Meister and Desert Island Fruits, and I had quite a few private messages on WhatsApp and Facebook, private messages at both those forums as well. People who just said, yeah, I sat down and watched the whole thing, all 2 hours 40 minutes of it. So I'm not pitching this as it's worth watching the whole thing again. It is, for me, the more complete version of the video, but it is mainly a slight change to the structure in a couple of places, few more sort of text explainers on the screen. And I've changed a couple of things, like that little bit right at the start, so that my dad's speech is clearer, because it was a little bit quiet on the original mix. But it is mostly the same video. I've also stuck a little bit. I had nowhere to put this on the original video, but there was at one point, me and my brother were driving down Blackpool Seafront after he'd played in a golf comp. So that was just past some of the old haunts you can see there in Blackpool. So I thought I'd just stick that on the end. With that, the whole thing comes to, it is nearly 2 hours and 45 minutes. So if you do want to watch it again, then obviously you are welcome to do so, but I would not pitch it as, necessarily worth the time again, in terms of it's like a whole new video and I've transformed the original. It is mostly the same. And that was one of the other things that came out of those private messages There was, again, there were a number of people who said that they'd been through something similar with one of their parents or someone close to them. It seems that the progression, well, the progression is the wrong word, isn't it? The progression of events, but the deterioration in condition is kind of reasonably well known. It's a sort of it's by no means unique. And like I say, we had no idea. I mean, knowing what I know now about it, and like I say, other people said that they'd witnessed the same thing, is you can kind of... It's like my dad was already dead and nobody knew it. By the time they got him into hospital, if he'd have rung for help on the 11th, if as soon as he'd come round from that fall and he'd rung 999 or he'd rung for help, one way or another, he'd have got to hospital, I think he would have had a chance. But because he was in bed, but he was unconscious for a period of time, bleeding at the bottom of the stairs, came round, dragged himself upstairs and went back to bed thinking he'd sleep it off. I mean, God almighty. For 40 hours or more. And by the time they got him to hospital, he was already in a bad way. They found a certain amount out in the hospital, and add that in with what came out of the inquest. In the fall, he'd broken 4 ribs. He had a partially collapsed lung. He was dehydrated because he'd been sort of dying in bed for 40 hours. He had diverticulitis of the bowel because of because of the fall and the impact and dragging himself back upstairs. And once pneumonia set in, one of the consultants said to my brother early on, if your dad doesn't get pneumonia, we're probably going to be okay here. If he does get pneumonia, he's probably going to die, which is a little bit, brutal, but it turned out to be true because he did get pneumonia. That was one of the drivers to get him into intensive care overnight from the Friday into the Saturday. He did develop pneumonia. And the official cause of death at the end of it all was multi-organ failure, pneumonia and rib fractures. There was also mentions whilst my dad was in hospital, but this came out more in the inquest, was that he had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, probably fairly well advanced as well. He'd been a heavy smoker for decades. His heart function was already impaired. Like, in years gone by, he kind of walked around golf courses with my brother and caddied for him. He'd been a very, very active man when he was younger, but at some point he got to the point where he couldn't even walk around a golf course with my brother. So his heart was not great. His heart was already in a bad way before all of this happened. And that, incidentally, is where we think the fall came from. We can never know for sure because nobody else was there and my dad had no recollection of it. But we're thinking and this is what the medical professionals said, is that with the COPD, he had, because those stairs at his house were nightmarishly steep, was that he just kind of got so out of breath or short of oxygen on the stairs that he'd fainted and fallen down them. So the COPD was quite a big part of this as well, and his heart was already sort of badly damaged and compromised before he'd even had the fall. So add the fall in and lying in bed for the better part of 48 hours before he'd even got to hospital, you can kind of understand how that ended up going the way it did. He was in a very, very bad way. By the time he got him to hospital, he was in a very bad way, and I just think he was on a clock at that point. I don't think the hospital did anything wrong. I don't think they missed anything. I think the damage was done before my dad got to hospital, and once he got there, he was just on a clock, and that deterioration in his condition was kind of baked in, and none of us knew. We all just kind of sleepwalked into it, not knowing that the gravity of the situation and how serious it was. The other things that were left up in the air from these 2 videos, from the death and the funeral one, if you remember my dad's house, as one of the extra bonus items that happened was when the police forced entry, when they got the welfare call from a neighbour, when the police forced entry to the house and destroyed a chunk of the kitchen in the process. That did get resolved. There was quite a bit of back and forward with the insurance company. We reached a little bit of an impasse with the insurance company because while my dad was still alive, they wouldn't discuss the policy. Then when he died, they said we need a death certificate, but we didn't have one. But in lieu of the inquest, we were given an interim death certificate. I think it's just called a fact of death certificate, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's literally just like, this person is dead. But what it allowed me to do was progress things with the insurance company. There was quite a lot of phone calls. There was a lot of emails. There was a lot of documents being sent back and forth. The insurance company themselves, in fairness, were actually pretty good. I managed to talk to a real human being without too much trouble and without spending too long on hold. I did get a little bit of conflicting advice on one occasion, but on one call in particular, I got exactly the right person to talk to who helped me get through all the sort of legal stuff around this, because it is quite difficult to take over these aspects of someone's life, particularly when there's no will. As I said in the original videos, there's no will on this. But we did get there in the end with the insurance company. They wouldn't pay the full quote. The quote that we got off the builder friend of my brother's was, I think, £7,450. We finished off with an insurance assessor going round to the house, and they said, look, we're not giving you that much. We're not paying for anything that will improve the inside of this house, because they said that this house is unlivable. You cannot live, notwithstanding the bit of it that had been knocked down, they said this house is just not fit for human habitation. So, even though my dad had been living there. So they were like, we're not paying for this. Anything that will improve the interior of this property. We're not doing pipe work. We're not doing anything to the sinks. We're not doing any of that. You can't have money for that. We will just make good the structure of the house. There was a little bit of back and forward. And I think in the end, they offered £4,400 or 4,400 odd pounds. My brother went back to his mate and said, look, can you do it for that? And he said, yeah. He said, I can do it for that. So it wasn't the kind of, like I say, I'll put some pictures on screen, but you can see that the main thing is the damage was fixed. We did get some money out of the insurance company, and it was enough to repair the damage. And the kitchen did get fixed. We got a new door put on. Nothing completely fell down. And the property was made secure again. So that was something at least. At one point, a tent did turn up in the backyard. My brother sent me, one of his mates had been going past the house and just kind of cast his eye around the back. And somebody had pitched up a tent in the backyard. But that disappeared. That disappeared after a week. Apparently, you've got to be quite careful about what you do with like physically removing people and stuff like that, but it disappeared. The tent and the person in it disappeared of their own accord after a few days, after a week or so. The house is still there. It's not sold yet. That's still to come. One other thing on that, by the way, is it turned out my dad had a big chunk of cash in the bank. If you remember what that house was like and how he was living, after the fact, there is a process, by the way, that you can pay for your own funeral that we progressed with the bank. And it turned out, and I'll give you the number, turned out my dad had £45,000 in the bank. So we got the funds out of the account to pay. So he paid for his own funeral out of his own bank account. The funeral was like £4,500 or something. So he paid for his own funeral, but then the bank said, right, okay, we've released the funds for the funeral. If you sign this document here, we'll release the rest of the money in the account to you. Now, I thought this was all going to have to go through probate and it was going to take forever. But apparently banks don't want dead people to have bank accounts with them because it's a real pain in the arse and it's just like an admin nightmare for them. They just want it off the books as quickly as possible. So what they did is they essentially sent like a legal document to me and my brother. And I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was basically like, if you're prepared to sign this and say that no one's going to come along and make any other claim on this estate and you are the only kind of... something to do with it, it all belongs to you and nobody else is going to come along. And if you make a false statement, we can do you and it'll be a criminal offence. But if you sign this bit of paper to that effect, we will release the rest of the funds in the deceased accounts to you. So we're like, okay, so we filled that in, sent it back to them, and literally the next day they put like over £40,000 into my brother's bank account, which we split between us. You saw the state of that house. It was not a money thing. My dad had £45,000 in the bank, and he was living as he was in that house. And most rooms didn't even have like lights in them. There was no working heating in most of the house. It still had running water, but yeah, I mean, you can see from the pictures. I'll put they'll be on screen now, but it was. I mean, obviously, I'd give the money back 50 times over to have my dad back, but that was what my brother had half an inkling that he had a chunk of cash in the bank, but that was released to us. Like I say, the bank just couldn't wait to get it off their books, so they released the funds for the funeral, and then once we'd gone through this little legal process, he said, there you go, have the rest of it. We just want to close the account and be done with it. The house is a whole different thing. It's taken a long, long time with the paperwork and all the rest of it. So the house is still sat there. It's still empty. We've already had to reinsure it once. We're going to have to reinsure it again this year. And apparently we're liable for 50% council tax this year as well. I think you get 1 year for the affairs of the deceased to be settled, and then whoever's left somehow, I don't quite know how this works, but we're now liable for 50%. They give us a 50% discount. That's nice of them, isn't it? But we're now liable for 50% council tax on there as well. So yeah, cheers, thanks for that, I suppose. But as it stands at the minute, it's still there and it's still empty. But on the whole, the loose threads were reasonably well tied up. One of my biggest worries was that the fucking house that whole bit of it was going to fall down, and then we'd have a whole nightmare with that, or that we couldn't reach any kind of accommodation with the insurance company. But the insurance company, in fairness, were not too bad, and we did get a settlement that did cover the damage, and we were able to get it fixed. So that was something at least. And yeah, I mean, it is what it is with the money. It is what it is. Neither me or my brother can quite make sense of how my dad could have that much cash and yet live as he did in that house. Really don't understand that. But I think, as I indicated in those two original videos there, you could not tell my dad a bloody thing about anything. He was the absolute dictionary definition of stubborn. So people had said things, people had tried things over the years, but he was having none of it, to the point that, and I this was in the My Dad Died video, that he kind of just stopped people going round to his house and sort of kept it a secret, really, which was the way he dealt with it for the last few years of his life. So the year since all that happened, it's been getting better. I think what I would say there is, and forgive the cliche, but time helps. The passage of time helps. For the first few weeks, for the first few months, really, it was kind of on my mind all the time. I remember thinking for the first 2 or 3 months, am I ever going to get to sleep again without the last thing, the things that I think about at night before I go to sleep? Are they going to be about my dad and the death of his dad? And could we have done something different? Was there some way to avoid this? Could we have done something quicker, or a different intervention once the accident had happened? Did we miss something? How far back do you need to go before we could have stopped this? Months or years, whatever. I've invented whole fucking things in my head, scenarios and ways and means of avoiding what happened. And that was for months. But then at some point, the frequency started to drop down. There were other things that were coming back into my head, and sometimes, even without me really realising it, I would fall asleep. I'd get to sleep at night, and I wouldn't be thinking about something to do with my dad before I fell asleep. I've had quite a lot of weird dreams and nightmares and all sorts, but a year down the line, it has eased quite a bit. It's still there. I still think about him a lot. A lot of the images of him in that hospital and his decline and all that stuff are still very, very much sort of burned into my brain. But it has been getting better. And obviously I have my friends here. I have Mrs. Degsy here, Degsy Jr. and things have carried on. I mean, I know that in the natural order of things anyway, is that our parents will die before I do. That will be normal because they are older than us. So if the general kind of circle of life sort of is followed, because they do say that, you know, and the cruelest thing is a parent, you know, burying their child. So the correct way round for that to happen is that the child will see their parents die in time. I wasn't quite expecting it to happen as soon as it did, but I guess ultimately it's one of those things that you kind of have to be prepared for. By far and away, I'm not the first person to go through it, and I won't be the last. And what I can say is, if it's not something that's happened to you, is that as dull as it sounds, that there's no way to shortcut it. You will hopefully find, as I have, that the passage of those times, as those months roll by, things will get better and it will get easier, and that grief will start, the rawness and the pain of that grief in the days and the weeks and the months after will turn into something more manageable, and whilst never nice, perhaps more you can think of good memories, you know, happy thoughts and happy memories that you may have of the person, and the pain, that you know, the open wound of that grief will start to subside, and it's more, and it'll start to become more an old wound that you're aware of, but it isn't consuming every moment of every day. And that's where I got to in the last year. And I know it'll be a process that will carry on as well. And I'm okay with that. I'm prepared for that to happen. So where am I going with all this? What's the point of this? Where does this tie in? Because I am aware that this is a Fruit Machine and Fruit Machine emulation channel. What's the point here? Well, first of all, it's just to let you know that this video will be going back up on the channel. Mostly the same. Few changes. It's my preferred version of it, but I don't want to oversell it and say, you know, if you watched it the first time round, the whole thing, you really should sit down and watch it again because this is the whole new thing. It isn't really, but I want this to be out there as what I would consider to be the slightly more complete and more refined version of it, and it does have that extra footage on the end of Blackpool as well. The other point about this, and this is where, because it's led me down a path with thinking that I want to do something in the Gambling Low Ebbs space, and the reason for that is slightly long-winded, so I'm going to keep it as brief as I can, which I know is difficult for me. I recently read a trio of books by a guy called David Nichols. It came out of watching One Day on Netflix. Now, I have covered that in the Fruit Machines in the Wrong Time and Place video, and that One Day on Netflix. I liked the TV series, the series so much on One Day. I was aware it had been based on a book. So I thought, you know what, that was fucking brilliant. I'm going to go and buy the book. So I went and bought One Day by David Nichols, which is brilliant. I cannot recommend it enough. It's a fantastic book. I thought, I really like this guy. I like his stuff. I'm going to buy some of his other books. And I bought a book called Us, and I bought a book called Sweet Sorrow, and I read those as well, and they are also fantastic books. But Sweet Sorrow was the one that really connected with me. And it got me thinking about all the way a good book, you know, the way that good art, dare I say, in a way that only good art can. And sometimes something just really connects with you. It could be a book, it could be a poem, it could be a music or a painting or a play or a film or whatever. But this book really kind of connected with me. It's about the amazing sort of emotional cataclysm of first love and all its imperfect glory, and looking back on it, many decades later, and assembling things in your mind. And it sent me off down a kind of a few mental corridors, particularly in the aftermath of losing my dad as well, because I did talk in those two videos, and I've talked many times on this channel before, including in the Gambling Low Ebbs videos, how were it not for my dad, I wouldn't have made it. I'd have been dead. I mean, that was the reason. If we have a look on the channel for Ebbs, that video there Where is it? Show all. There we are. The Gambling Low Ebbs videos will be coming back online. There we are. Where I did say very, very clearly that my dad was a big part of most of these, where my life would have ended up, well, ending, frankly, were it not for my dad. So reading this book got me thinking about all sorts of things. And what I did in the aftermath, I thought, you know what, I want to try and there's a few things I want to try and get my head around here, including my own first love, and kind of casting thoughts back in general and trying to understand things a little bit more. So as it happens, I still have my diaries from 1989, 1990 and 1994 as physical copies. My diary for 1989 was handwritten. In a proper diary, I'll put a picture of it on screen. My diary for 1990 was the same for about half of it up until June or July, when I got a Commodore 64 system, including a printer. And I printed it out for the second half of 1990. I printed it out. Now, going into 91, I still kept the diary, but it's only on discs. I don't have a physical copy of it. Now, under the stairs, amongst all of my tech from the decades gone past, there's all kinds of stuff under there. You know, from the Super Nintendo forward, there's a Super Nintendo, a Mega Drive, a Dreamcast, a PlayStation 1, a PlayStation 2, a Wii U, 2 Xbox 360s, an Amiga 1200, a Commodore 64 with two 1541 disk drives and an MPS 803 printer. That's just off the top of my head. There's Sega Saturn in there as well. You kind of name it, really. A bit of tech from the last 30 years. There's a reasonable chance that there's going to be one of them under there. And my diary from 91 and a chunk of 1992 is on Commodore 64 discs that I kept in a bit of software called Mini Office. The problem with that, first of all, I'd have to dig it all out and get it set up. I do still have an old CRT telly that I could set it up on, but the other problem is that it almost certainly won't work. When you get to this old kit, Commodore 64s and 1541 disk drives and their power supplies as well, there's all kinds of things that can go bad on them over enough time. So the chances of me plugging all this stuff back in and having it work and have the discs be readable, bearing in mind that these discs are now 33, 34 years old, the chances of all of the kit working and the discs being readable is pretty limited. That said, I am going to have a go at it in due course, but there's a whole load of clearance that we need to do first from it. It's a massive, quite a big space under the stairs in our house. So there's some clearances that we need to do. Then I need to find a way to get some of the stuff out of there and pick all the Commodore 64 stuff out, find somewhere to set it up and plug it all in and see if it works. That's a job. That's not a job for this day or this week. That's something in the future. But in the meantime, most pertinently to what I'm talking about here, is I have physical diaries from 1990 and 1994. 91, 92, 93. Some of it's on those discs. Some of it doesn't exist because for a chunk of that, I didn't keep a diary. My life, frankly, was so chaotic at that time for all of the reasons that I've talked about in these Gambling Low Ebbs videos that my keeping of a diary was somewhat erratic. However, I've got 1990 and 1994. Now, what I've done, and like I say, it was all in the aftermath of reading that Sweet Sorrow book. I've reread them. I've reread 89, 90 and 94. There was a whole first love thing going on, which I shall not bore you with in this video. The bit that's going to be relevant to this is the fruit machine stuff. Because at the back end of 1990, and I've talked about this in the interview with Cheerful Pessimist, and I've mentioned it on this channel before, I started playing fruit machines at the back end of 1990. and me and my friends were tentatively starting to go to the pub. However, 1990 really wasn't that bad. I was only putting a few pounds in them here and there. They were the first kind of, like, I was writing, and probably do we stop playing these things, but they weren't too bad. 1990, frankly, there was no real fruit machine drama particularly. But 1994 is a whole different scenario. Now, if you remember, I did this document here. Hang on, let me bring it in. I put this into one of, I think it was Gambling Low Ebbs Part 5 that I put this into it in the video itself. And can you see here that 3 of these Gambling Low Ebbs are in 1994, and I have the diary. Now, it turns out that I was actually pretty much bang on here with my dates from my memory. I was kind of right on where these fit in. So the physical diary that I have, which is all printouts, these are old printouts from a Commodore MPS 803 printer. I have the diary for Gambling Low Ebbs Part 2, Part 3, and almost Part 5. The diary ends in August 94, and the events of Gambling Low Ebbs Part 5 are just about to occur. So slightly suspicious end of diary there, bearing in mind what transpired in Gambling Low Ebbs Part 5. Now, whether or not they're still on the discs, I don't know. Whether or not I just stopped printing it out or I stopped writing it completely, I can't really remember. However, I have read 1994, and it's pretty grim. It's not great. This is someone that the younger version of me who is consumed by fruit machine addiction. It's not pretty. It's as I was reading it, I got to the point where I was getting slightly twitchy, where I was just fucking myself time and time again with fruit machines, and various people pulling me out of the fire, most notably my dad, who would have been well within his rights to fucking kill me on the spot, the way I was dicking him around with money and my behaviour. But friends as well, and unbelievably, I actually started going out with Mrs. Degsy in that period of time as well. So what I'm going to do is go back to that, and we'll do a Gambling Low Ebbs the diary year, because I have it from December 93 to August 94, and I'm going to go through, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to sort of serialise it for the channel, and we'll track the madness of the fruit machines and also how much I was losing. At one point in this diary, I started up the fruitiometer, which was a daily record of how much I was winning or losing on the fruit machines. Spoiler alert, I was almost always losing, but I didn't keep it up for very long because the numbers were getting too bad. So what I'm going to do is when I go back and read it again and do the serialization for the channel, I'm going to do it because I have written down how much I'm losing on any given day, but the fruitiometer didn't last very long. So what we're going to do is go through that, and we're going to work out by adding it all up as we go along how much I managed to lose on fruit machines between December 93 and August 94. We're going to look at the madness of fruit machine addiction during that time and have a talk around the machines that were around at the time. I've got to be honest with you, I didn't always. I wish I would have been a little bit better in documenting the actual machines that I was playing. There are some direct machine references in there. There's references to Hidden Treasures machines. There's a Popeye gets mentioned at one point. There's one where I talk about a new machine I hadn't seen before, which I realise is not very useful, but I have a very clear memory in my head that was actually a Jurassic Trail by Ace. I remember, as I was reading it in the diary, I remember that. That was Jurassic Trail by Ace, and it was the first time I'd seen one. So we've got there. I don't know quite how I'm going to do it in terms of splitting it up into videos for the channel. But it will be more than one, and we'll go through that, because it's an absolute horror show of the constantly scrabbling around. Like, I'm permanently skint, and yet somehow I keep managing to get some money from somewhere. and then almost invariably just end up down the arcade or the pub, spunking it in fruit machines. Like, I'll get together 20, 30, 40 quid. In 1994 prices as well, remember. So it was a little bit more money back then than it is now. And then it just obliterate myself time and time again. It's quite horrible, but I think it will be instructive of the insanity of addiction. And it's all written down. This is the thing. It's actually there. It's a document of these periods of months. And this wasn't the end of it, by the way, either. It carried on for years after this, but we have got these sort of 8-9 months here where I've kept a track of how fruit machines were demolishing me on a daily basis. And I'll be able to do it with the usual kind of visuals. So I've had a quick look round on Google Maps. A lot of the pubs are still there, the locations that the arcades were. We can get some historical pictures, all that kind of thing. So what we're going to have is a little kind of documentary of the life of a fruit machine player in 1994. It also takes in incidentally, the Cash Zone video that I did not that long ago, where I couldn't remember. I had a guess at when it was in the video. Well, it turns out that Cash Zone incident where it repeated all the way out, that was in there. That was in that 1994 diary, and I was writing about it at the time. And kind of like I said in the video, that I picked this machine because I was nearly fucking skinned. So I thought, oh, well, at least it'll keep me gambling for a bit longer. And it's right there. It's written down in 1994 that I play. Now, again, I don't actually call it Cash Zone. So, I picked a machine that's normally all right just for a few quid to get a feature, and was well surprised when the £2.40 repeater went nuts. So there's quite actually, one way or another, there's some stuff that I've talked about on the channel over the years, which is in there as well. So I think it will probably work as a kind of, and I'm not intending it to be some horrible, morose, grinding, miserable thing, even though in some regards it is, because I guess I made it. I'm still here. I'm talking about it. So the bastards didn't fucking kill me. There is some serious stuff in there, and this is how it all links in with my dad, who just brought me back from the brink time and time again. Some of what's in there, to be honest with you, is pretty horrible. But my approach to it the intention is to be that they're not horrible, miserable videos to watch. That there will be some entertainment factor in there, and I'm hoping to bring them together in videos where we can look at the places, the old haunts in Manchester. We've got my first visit to the Isle of Man is in there. And even then, desperately scrapping around for money. That shit job that I had in Gambling Low Ebbs Part 2, the one where I was kind of starving myself to death, and my dad was bringing, because I was spending all my money on fruit machines, my dad started putting food in the cupboards in the kitchen and that sort of thing. So it does come. We basically got the documents for Gambling Low Ebbs Parts 2, 3, and the lead into 5. You can actually see the apocalypse of the lead into Gambling Low Ebbs Part 5 is in there as well. Going to be a lot of memories of fruit machines, a lot of places that we can look at, and hopefully it'll make a little bit of a story sequence. And maybe it will give some of you something to listen to that will maybe in some way help you as well, because this is the other thing that I have had. But wasn't something I really thought about or was expecting many times over the years with the channel. And some people have been leaving comments recently as well, because I have opened comments again on the channel, that they actually find my videos useful. That someone who's been through all this shit, been through this addiction, been through some really, really low times, and to just talk about it and to just give a voice to it as well. This kind of sense of, not being alone, and somebody else has been through this stuff as well. So if it's even remotely useful to anyone on that level, then I guess it's kind of useful as well, and it's a worthwhile endeavour in that regard too. So that's kind of where I'm going with it. That's my intention. That's not all I'm going to be doing. That's kind of like a sort of ongoing project. I'll bite clumps of that off as and when I can, because there's a lot of material for 1994. When I was reading through it, it was only towards the back end of what I had in my diary there that I thought, you know what, that might actually work for the channel. So I'm going to have to do it all over again to actually get the relevant sections and get the numbers and all that sort of thing. So that will be a little bit of work in and of itself. So I'll get to that in due course. But my intention is to do the other sort of normal content for the channel. You know, I'm trying to get a new video up every 3 or 4 weeks, and I'll try and keep that going, as well as doing this as well. So this won't be the only thing. It will be, and in addition to that, is certainly my intention. So I think that will do for now. So just so you're aware, I'm going to re-render this video back out as it is. So that will be going up on the channel probably in the next 2 or 3 days. If you wish to watch it or not, of course, that's an entirely your decision. I do want to be clear, it's mostly the same as the upload from last year. So I will leave it there at this point. I think that's enough waffle, isn't it? So, like I say, we know what my plans are for the channel for the next few months. Try and get a new video up every few weeks, and do this whole Gambling Low Ebbs the diary year. So, with all that said, thank you very much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will catch up with you next time. But for now it is goodbye.